Jasmine Crockett didn't come to debate. She came to indict. Across from her sat Judge Judy, 32 years of courtroom fame, now cornered by one file and 19 years of buried bias. Two defendants, same crime, one black, one white, a 12-year gap. Judy's signature sealed it. Silence followed. When justice gets exposed by its own paper trail, what's left to defend? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The studio wasn't just quiet. It was tense, loaded, surgical. CNN had transformed it into something between a courtroom and a battlefield. Blinding spotlights beamed down from above, creating a white-hot focus on the polished walnut desk shaped like a judge's bench. Surrounding it in a tight semicircle were rows of hand-picked guests, former prosecutors, public defenders, activists, veterans, all with one instruction. Watch but do not interfere. No applause, no music, no distractions. Just two chairs, two microphones, and two women who had no intention of backing down. Anderson Cooper stood dead center, palms tight around his cue cards, eyes flicking between the guests like a man waiting for thunder. To his left sat Judge Judy Sheindlin, 81 years old, spine straight as steel, the same piercing glare she'd used to dominate television for 2 decades. To his right sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, 43, arms still, face unreadable, dressed in navy blue but radiating defiance like a storm gathering over calm water. Something about her stillness was louder than shouting. Then Anderson looked up and spoke, quiet but with the precision of a scalpel. Do you believe sentencing in America is applied equally across race and class? The question dropped like a blade on glass. Judy struck first. Justice is blind, she said, slicing through the silence. I've sentenced people of every color, background, and bank account. You break the law, you face the law. That's justice, not excuses. Her voice was sharp, firm, absolute, the voice of a gavel that had struck thousands of times. Jasmine didn't blink. She nodded once, slowly, and then leaned in just enough to be dangerous. We don't have a justice system, she said, her tone low but sharp as a knife's edge. We have a punishment machine, and it doesn't hit everyone the same. The room tightened. Judy leaned back slightly, but her jaw locked. Jasmine's next words were a bullet wrapped in velvet. Black defendants get 19% longer sentences than white defendants for the same crimes. That's not justice. That's design. You could hear someone exhale too loudly in the crowd. Judy's hands froze above the table. Anderson lowered his cue cards like they were suddenly useless. The temperature didn't rise. But something far more dangerous did. The weight of truth meeting the pride of power, face to face, under the glare of studio lights that now felt more like an interrogation lamp. She slammed her hand down, not gently, not by accident. The crack of her palm against the table ricocheted through the studio like a shot fired. Justice is blind. Her voice sliced through the air, fierce and absolute. Her posture locked forward like a predator sensing weakness. It doesn't care what color you are. It cares what you do. Each word felt like a ruling, the kind no one could appeal. She wasn't just making a point. She was drawing a line in the sand. I've spent decades watching people blame the system instead of blaming the choices they make. Enough is enough. Judy's eyes blazed with the fury of someone who had never been challenged this way. Not by politicians, not by lawyers, not on live television. The tension wasn't rising. It had already arrived. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look away. Her reply came like a scalpel, cold, clean, and slow. Then explain this, she said, her hand sliding a folder forward. A black teenager caught with marijuana in Houston gets 4 years in prison. A white college student in Austin, caught with twice as much, gets probation. Same state, same year, same law, 2 systems. Her voice didn't shake. It carved. Judge Judy didn't respond immediately, but her jaw tightened. Her fingers tapped once. Then she said it again, louder. Stop with the excuses. And then came the final snap. You commit the crime, you pay the price. In the audience, the air shifted, not because of noise, but because of the silence that followed. A silence that didn't come from peace, but from shock. Anderson Cooper didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes were darting now, not from curiosity, but from alarm. The energy in the room had become unbearable, like watching two tectonic plates crash beneath your feet. Slow, certain, and deadly. And somewhere in the back row, someone whispered just loud enough to be heard on a mic that should have been off. That wasn't justice. That was a confession. The facts had landed, the pressure had peaked, but Judge Judy wasn't here to lose ground. Not to numbers, and certainly not to a woman who hadn't even finished her first term in Congress. Judge Judy shifted her weight with the slow certainty of someone who had sentenced generations and had no intention of being questioned now. Her eyes narrowed into sharp lines, and her voice dropped just enough to be dangerous. "You've been in Congress for what, 5 minutes?" she snapped, the words laced with condescension and the unmistakable sting of a personal attack. "And you think you understand justice better than someone who's lived it for over 30 years? The insult hung heavy in the room, not as a question, but as a verdict already delivered. Judy wasn't debating anymore. She was trying to dismantle Jasmine's credibility in real time. Her finger lifted, pointed not at the argument, but at the woman herself. "Your generation only knows how to blame the system," she continued, voice hardening. "You don't believe in consequences. You believe in excuses." The room didn't gasp, but it shifted, as if everyone realized the rules had just changed, and this was no longer about policy. It was personal, and Judge Judy had fired the first shot. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't even blink. The attack had been blunt, intended to provoke, to push her into emotion, into rage, but none came. Instead, she sat still, like a statue built from something colder than marble, her silence heavier than any retort. She let the moment expand, let the insult breathe, not out of weakness, but out of absolute control. The cameras zoomed in without instruction. Anderson Cooper glanced between them, his cue cards limp in his hands, as if even he knew whatever came next wouldn't follow any script. Jasmine slowly straightened her back, the slightest movement turning the power dynamic in the room on its head. She placed her hands gently on the desk, fingers unmoving, her posture calm, but unmistakably dominant. Then, she smiled, not wide, not soft. A small, razor-thin curve of the lips that said everything Judy hadn't prepared for. The kind of smile that only appears when someone's already read the last page of the book and knows how it ends. She leaned forward, not aggressively, but with the quiet pressure of gravity itself. Her voice, when it came, was soft, clear, and utterly unshaken. "Let me ask you a question, Judge." 10 words, no more, but they carried more weight than everything spoken before them. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't defensive. It was a pivot, an emotional turning point sharp enough to cut through the tension without ever needing to raise its voice. The audience didn't move, didn't breathe. Judge Judy's mouth parted slightly, perhaps to speak, perhaps to brace. But Jasmine wasn't done with numbers, nor with proving a point. She was done being spoken to like a novice. And now with that one quiet question, she had flipped the courtroom inside out, without leaving her chair. Her voice was calm, but sharp enough to cut. "Have you ever asked why communities of color show up in your courtroom more than others?" The question didn't come from anger. It came from experience, and it stopped the room cold. For a second, it looked like Judy might pause, might consider, but no. The answer came fast, sharp, automatic. "Because they commit more crime." That was it. 5 words, just like that. The sentence left Judy's mouth like it was fact, not just said, but believed, carried with the authority of someone who had never been made to explain it. But the moment it landed, everything changed. The air went dense. The cameras seemed to tilt in. Anderson Cooper blinked twice, visibly stiffening. It wasn't just a response. It was a crack in the foundation, and Jasmine saw it. She didn't recoil. She didn't even blink. She just looked at Judy, calm, steady, unflinching. No words, not yet. The weight of silence did all the talking. And then, without raising her voice, she said what half the room was already thinking. "That answer right there is exactly why we need criminal justice reform." Her tone didn't shift, but the atmosphere did. You could feel it. a quiet tightening of every breath in the room. Judy remained still, almost daring her to continue, but Jasmine didn't need permission. She leaned in, her voice clear as glass. It's not about who commits more crime, it's about where we choose to look for it. She slowly slid a folded page across the table. Data, quietly delivered, the way a prosecutor lays down her final piece of evidence. You over-police black neighborhoods, you stop more people, you arrest more people, and then you turn around and say those communities are inherently more criminal. She didn't blink. That's not crime, that's surveillance. Judy's face didn't move, but her body did, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, the weight of that line sinking in deeper than she wanted to show. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Her words came faster now, not angry, but urgent, like pressure breaking through a dam. It's not behavior being tracked, it's geography being targeted. She tapped the page softly, the paper barely making a sound, but it hit louder than anything Judy had said all night. The problem isn't who's getting arrested, it's where we choose to put the handcuffs. A producer behind the camera mouthed something, probably to cut to commercial, but no one moved. This wasn't television anymore. It was something rawer, deeper. Jasmine straightened slightly, her tone ironclad. And the data shows it, year after year. You send 10 patrol cars into one zip code and none into another. Guess where the crime's going to be reported? The lights above seemed to flicker just enough to echo the discomfort below. She gave it a beat, just one, then reached for a second document without looking down. And if we're going to talk about fair sentencing, she said, let's talk about the crack laws. Her voice didn't rise, but her words grew heavier with each step. Crack cocaine, mostly used in poor black communities, carried mandatory minimum sentences up to 100 times harsher than powder cocaine, used by white college kids and stockbrokers. She glanced briefly at the audience, not for applause, but for truth. Same drug, same effect, but completely different consequences because of who was holding it. Judy didn't speak. Jasmine didn't expect her to. She continued without missing a beat. You want to talk about accountability? Start with that. Start with laws that were written with a target in mind and a community already in the crosshairs. She paused, but only long enough to let the words settle like dust over old verdicts. That's not justice. That's strategy. Now Judy looked smaller, not physically, but in presence. The usual fire in her voice was gone, replaced by a silence that didn't command authority. It answered to it. She stared forward, lips tight, jaw clenched, eyes flicking toward the camera, just long enough to catch her reflection in this new conversation. Jasmine, meanwhile, didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just sat in the truth she'd laid bare. The courtroom had shifted. The bench no longer held the power. The voice behind the mic did. And while Judy had built a career on commanding the last word, here, under the unrelenting light of the facts, there were no sound bites left to save her. Jasmine leaned back slightly, just enough to say, "Your turn." But Judy had already taken hers, and she had thrown it away with 5 words that history would not forget. Jasmine didn't break eye contact. Her posture didn't shift. She let the moment stretch until it became its own kind of judgment, one that didn't require a robe or a gavel. Then in a voice that was quiet but unmistakably loaded, she said it. "I don't just process cases, I fight for lives." The words weren't spoken for effect. They were spoken like truth pressed between teeth. They landed not like statistics, but like weight, emotional, personal, human. Judge Judy made a sharp motion, mouth parting to interrupt, but Jasmine calmly raised her hand, never losing her composure, and said with perfect poise, "I'm not finished, Your Honor." It was a phrase soaked in both protocol and power, a legal warning and a moral declaration at once. There was no rise in tone, no show of defiance, just quiet command. Judy's finger curled slightly, but she didn't speak. The room tightened again. Jasmine continued, but her voice had changed. Cool steel beneath soft velvet. "Before I was elected, I was a public defender and a civil rights attorney. I didn't watch the system from a bench. I stood in front of it every single day." Her words moved like chess pieces, each one deliberate, building pressure with precision. "I've represented kids who were thrown into cages for nonviolent offenses. 15-year-old boys sent away for 15 years because they stole a weapon, usually out of fear, often without ever pulling a trigger. She didn't blink. And in the very same courtroom, I watched white defendants, same age, same crime, walk out with probation and a second chance handed to them like a party favor. The lights didn't dim, but they felt colder now. The audience had stopped shifting. No one even cleared their throat. Jasmine was no longer arguing. She was testifying. She reached down and slowly pulled a folder from beneath the edge of the table. Her hands didn't shake. There was no performance here, just purpose. "Let's talk about one of those cases, shall we?" she said, her eyes still locked on Judy's face. "Let's talk about Darnell Hayes." The name dropped like a heavy coin in a well. Deep, echoing, impossible to ignore. Judy blinked just once. Jasmine's tone didn't change. Darnell was 17 when he broke into a corner store. He took a bag of chips and a roll of batteries. Total value, $50. She opened the folder and tapped the top of the page. "You gave him 2 years in jail." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. Then, as if pulling the floor out from beneath the table, she flipped to another page. Brett Langston, 19 years old, arrested for stealing a Rolex. $900. Jasmine's eyes narrowed. Same year, same courtroom, same judge. She closed the folder with a soft click. He got a warning. The silence in the room became suffocating. Not because it was empty, but because it was full. Full of implications. Full of receipts. Full of the things no one ever says out loud in public until someone like Jasmine Crockett walks in and refuses to stay quiet. Judy didn't respond. She didn't shake her head or object. She didn't even lift her chin. Her hands were still, but her face was no longer composed. The redness was climbing up her cheeks, and she looked down for a fraction of a second. Not to read, to escape. Anderson Cooper remained frozen, his eyes darting between the two women like a man standing between tectonic plates. But no one moved. No one could. Jasmine still hadn't raised her voice. She kept going, her voice now low but searing. "This isn't about hypotheticals. This is about people. It's about mothers losing their children because they fell short once and happened to be the wrong color when they did." Her tone wasn't trembling. It was steady, grounded, dangerous in its restraint. "I've seen Black mothers lose custody because of a relapse. And in the very same courthouse, I've watched white mothers get a therapist, a rehab center, and a written recommendation for reunification." Her hands stayed flat on the table. She wasn't gesturing. She was anchoring. That's not about crime. That's about credibility. About who the system views as redeemable and who it writes off without a second thought. Every word landed like a gavel, and not a single one bounced back. Judy remained silent. Her eyes weren't cold now. They were distant. She wasn't preparing a rebuttal. She was absorbing damage. Because Jasmine wasn't just holding a mirror up, she was making her look into it. Jasmine tapped the folder one last time and said, "This isn't emotion. This isn't opinion. This is the truth, and it has your signature on it." That line didn't scream. It whispered, but it screamed inside people. Cooper exhaled through his nose, slow, measured, like someone trying not to make a sound in a room full of glass. Jasmine gave no mercy, not in tone, not in message. She sat still, jaw firm, and then ended it with the quietest blow of all. "You see case files. I see kids who lost their future. And that one was the moment. The one nobody expected. Not the audience, not the host, and not Judge Judy. The silence stretched, dense and electrified, but not empty. It wasn't fear that held the room still. It was expectation. Because everyone knew Jasmine Crockett hadn't said her final word. And Judge Judy, for the first time in her televised legacy, had no defense ready. What came next wasn't going to be a rebuttal. It was going to be a reckoning. Jasmine didn't rise like a politician. She rose like a storm rolling in. Calm on the surface, unstoppable underneath. Her chair barely made a sound, but her presence swelled the second she stood. Her hands stayed at her sides, controlled, but the energy around her shifted like pressure before thunder. Her eyes never left Judy's, not for a heartbeat. She didn't glare. She didn't blink. She simply stared, with the quiet focus of someone who had watched injustice too long to flinch at its face now. Cameras instinctively followed her movement, lenses adjusting to capture what every person in that room could already feel. Jasmine Crockett wasn't asking for permission anymore. She was claiming space, and then standing tall and unshaken, she said it. Sharp, deliberate, devastating. You turned a courtroom into a television show. The words hit like glass shattering across marble. They weren't loud, but they rang out with brutal clarity. Jasmine wasn't grandstanding. She was exposing. Every syllable peeled back layers of performance, stripping away robes and ratings until only intent was left. Her voice never wavered. You made a spectacle of suffering, a stage out of sentencing, her tone said without needing extra words. And then she moved forward, not to threaten, not to provoke, but to make sure her words landed face to face. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. The weight of her calm was heavier than fury. You humiliated people who couldn't afford lawyers, her voice seemed to say in silence. And then you turned it into syndication. When her next words came, they didn't arrive with anger. They arrived with certainty. You made millions of dollars yelling at poor people who couldn't yell back. The air in the room thinned. It wasn't the shock of a lie. It was the realization of a truth no one had ever spoken to Judy's face before. A producer in the control booth whispered, "Don't cut," into the comms. Anderson Cooper didn't move. Judy didn't breathe. Jasmine's eyes didn't flicker away, not even for a blink. Her tone remained composed, but every word she spoke tightened the noose around a legacy built on authority and applause. She wasn't trying to win anymore. She was closing a case. Her hands stayed by her sides, but her voice carried the edge of a closing argument that left no room for rebuttal. The audience still hadn't moved. No coughs, no whispers, just the sound of an empire cracking one truth at a time. Jasmine's next line didn't explode. It pierced. You call that strength? That's bullying. The word landed like a verdict. Judge Judy's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Her signature stare, once used to silence rooms, was now hollow, a reflex without power. She tried to hold her posture, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. Her fingers curled over the edge of the desk, gripping something invisible. Control, maybe, or the last trace of pride. But Jasmine was unshaken. There was no gloating in her eyes, just stillness, authority, and the slow, undeniable erosion of a myth. The woman who had once dominated daytime television by commanding every second of every room now sat motionless, wordless, stunned. Jasmine didn't smirk. She didn't flinch. She let the silence do the echoing. And then she spoke the line that would be remembered longer than anything Judge Judy had ever said. I don't fear bullies, no matter how famous they are. The room didn't erupt. It collapsed inward. Every person watching knew it. That line didn't just end the argument, it ended the illusion. Jasmine Crockett had taken the highest paid voice in courtroom entertainment and showed the world that real power doesn't come from shouting. It comes from knowing exactly when to speak and exactly how deep to cut. Judy didn't respond. She couldn't, because there was nothing left to say. Her silence wasn't strategic. It wasn't composed. It was the sound of a career being recalibrated in real time. And as Jasmine stood there, not flinching, not blinking, not moving, you could feel the shift in gravity. For 30 years, Judge Judy had built a reputation on having the last word. But tonight, that word wasn't hers. And the silence she sat in wasn't just awkward. It was earned. It was thunderous. It was the price of every unchecked dismissal, every performance dressed as justice, every raised voice that mocked someone too poor to fight back. Jasmine hadn't taken her down with rage or insult. She had done it with composure, truth, and surgical control. And now, as the world watched, as cameras kept rolling, and as producers whispered into earpieces trying to decide when to cut, Judy Shinlin sat in a silence deeper than any monologue she'd ever delivered. Jasmine's final words had landed like thunder. I'm not afraid of bullies, no matter how famous they are. But the silence that followed was louder than anything she had said. And now the entire room had to live in it. The moment hung like a verdict in midair, unspoken yet irreversible. No one moved. Not even the cameras dared zoom in too fast, as if they too understood that something sacred had just shattered. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was electric, heavy, reverent. Judge Judy sat as if petrified, her spine straight but her spirit visibly bent. Her mouth was closed, her hands motionless, two tight fists resting on a table that had seen her dominate for decades. But tonight she wasn't the hammer. She was the nail. The woman who had silenced thousands now found herself drowning in her own stillness. Jasmine Crockett, still standing, didn't move an inch. She didn't need to. The weight of truth had already tipped the scales, and everyone in the room knew it. Anderson Cooper, sitting just feet away, was visibly unsettled. He shuffled the cue cards in front of him as if buying time, his face trying to recover a tone of professionalism that no longer fit the scene. "Well, I think that's, all the time we have for tonight," he said, his voice slightly cracking. It was the sound of a man trying to close the curtain on a fire that had already burned through the stage. No applause followed, no laughter, no polite acknowledgments from the crowd. Just the quiet hiss of tension still evaporating off the floor. A few people in the front row shifted in their seats, not because they were ready to leave, but because they weren't sure how to exist in the moment that had just been born. Jasmine didn't break eye contact with the table in front of her. She reached for her folder slowly, methodically, like a surgeon closing up after a long and successful operation. There was no rush. She wasn't fleeing. She was finishing. Across the table, Judy still hadn't raised her head. Her eyes, once fierce and unflinching, now stared blankly at the wood grain beneath her palms. She looked smaller, less like a TV titan, and more like a retired judge, wondering when the cameras had stopped being her friend. For a woman who had made a career out of commanding attention, her stillness was almost painful to witness. The silence was no longer dramatic. It was devastating. The audience watched, motionless, as if afraid that even blinking would break the fragile new reality that had formed in the last 60 seconds. Jasmine stood, not abruptly, not triumphantly, but intentionally, like a woman who had just carried her truth across enemy lines and laid it bare in the very heart of a fortress. Her every move was silent, but every gesture was louder than any microphone could capture. The sound of her folder closing was the only real noise in the room, yet it felt like a gavel being dropped from heaven. She adjusted her papers, stacked them neatly, and then took one step back from the table. Her heels struck the floor with a clean, sharp rhythm. 2 clicks, perfectly timed, like the final 2 notes of a closing argument. She didn't look around for applause. She didn't glance at the cameras. She didn't need the world's validation. She had already taken the only thing that mattered, the truth out loud and unchallenged. Judge Judy didn't say a word, and that silence spoke more than any of her 30 years of television ever had. Anderson cleared his throat again, but the moment had already slipped away from him. He was just background noise now, a host trying to wrap up a program that had spiraled into history. "Thank you, both of you," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He turned toward the camera, blinking as if searching for the teleprompter to give him an exit line. But there wasn't one. There were no lines left to read. Everything had already been said. The show wasn't ending. It had transformed into something else entirely. Not a debate, not a town hall, a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett had delivered it with surgical precision. The room, built for television, now felt like something ancient, like a temple after a trial, or a battlefield where only one soldier walked away unscarred. The set had become sacred, not because of what it represented, but because of what had just been stripped from it. Judy's decades of moral superiority now sat like rubble in her silence. She hadn't been outshouted. She had been outlived by a truth she refused to see coming. And Jasmine, she wasn't just a guest, she was a turning point. As she turned and walked toward the exit, her back straight, her eyes forward, every lens in the studio followed, but no one dared say her name. Behind her, Judy still hadn't moved. Her expression was unreadable, her breath shallow, and perhaps the most shocking thing of all was not what she had said, but what she had failed to say in return. For the first time, the queen of courtroom television had been rendered speechless, not by insult, not by disrespect, but by data, memory, in the undeniable force of lived experience. The same woman who once prided herself on always getting the last word now had no words left to stand on. And that absence, that void of response, was deafening. The studio lights remained steady, but the room felt darker, like the echo of a thunderstorm still lingering in the walls. The camera operators stood still, waiting for direction, but none came. The audience remained seated, not because they were told to, but because they couldn't leave. Not yet. They had witnessed a rupture in real time, a moment where power didn't shift gradually, it snapped. And when it snapped, it didn't make noise. It made clarity. As Jasmine exited the stage, the only thing louder than the silence was the knowledge now stitched into everyone's memory. That Judge Judy, the woman who never lost control, had just been met by someone who didn't want her crown, just her conscience. And what she found there was an empty bench. The moment hung like a verdict in midair, unspoken, yet irreversible. No one moved. Not even the cameras dared zoom in too fast, as if they too understood that something sacred had just shattered. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was electric, heavy, reverent. Judge Judy sat as if petrified, her spine straight but her spirit visibly bent. Her mouth was closed, her hands motionless, two tight fists resting on a table that had seen her dominate for decades. But tonight she wasn't the hammer. She was the nail. The woman who had silenced thousands now found herself drowning in her own stillness. Jasmine Crockett, still standing, didn't move an inch. She didn't need to. The weight of truth had already tipped the scales, and everyone in the room knew it. Anderson Cooper, sitting just feet away, was visibly unsettled. He shuffled the cue cards in front of him as if buying time, his face trying to recover a tone of professionalism that no longer fit the scene. "Well, I think that's, all the time we have for tonight," he said, his voice slightly cracking. It was the sound of a man trying to close the curtain on a fire that had already burned through the stage. No applause followed, no laughter, no polite acknowledgments from the crowd. Just the quiet hiss of tension still evaporating off the floor. A few people in the front row shifted in their seats, not because they were ready to leave, but because they weren't sure how to exist in the moment that had just been born. Jasmine didn't break eye contact with the table in front of her. She reached for her folder slowly, methodically, like a surgeon closing up after a long and successful operation. There was no rush. She wasn't fleeing. She was finishing. Across the table, Judy still hadn't raised her head. Her eyes, once fierce and unflinching, now stared blankly at the wood grain beneath her palms. She looked smaller, less like a TV titan, and more like a retired judge wondering when the cameras had stopped being her friend. For a woman who had made a career out of commanding attention, her stillness was almost painful to witness. The silence was no longer dramatic. It was devastating. The audience watched, motionless, as if afraid that even blinking would break the fragile new reality that had formed in the last 60 seconds. Jasmine stood, not abruptly, not triumphantly, but intentionally, like a woman who had just carried her truth across enemy lines and laid it bare in the very heart of a fortress. Her every move was silent, but every gesture was louder than any microphone could capture. The sound of her folder closing was the only real noise in the room. Yet it felt like a gavel being dropped from heaven. She adjusted her papers, stacked them neatly, and then took one step back from the table. Her heels struck the floor with a clean, sharp rhythm. 2 clicks, perfectly timed, like the final 2 notes of a closing argument. She didn't look around for applause. She didn't glance at the cameras. She didn't need the world's validation. She had already taken the only thing that mattered, the truth out loud and unchallenged. Judge Judy didn't say a word, and that silence spoke more than any of her 30 years of television ever had. Anderson cleared his throat again, but the moment had already slipped away from him. He was just background noise now, a host trying to wrap up a program that had spiraled into history. "Thank you, both of you," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He turned toward the camera, blinking as if searching for the teleprompter to give him an exit line. But there wasn't one. There were no lines left to read. Everything had already been said. The show wasn't ending. It had transformed into something else entirely, not a debate, not a town hall, a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett had delivered it with surgical precision. The room built for television now felt like something ancient, like a temple after a trial, or a battlefield where only one soldier walked away unscarred. The set had become sacred, not because of what it represented, but because of what had just been stripped from it. Judy's decades of moral superiority now sat like rubble in her silence. She hadn't been outshouted. She had been outlived by a truth she refused to see coming. And Jasmine? She wasn't just a guest. She was a turning point. As she turned and walked toward the exit, her back straight, her eyes forward, every lens in the studio followed, but no one dared say her name. Behind her, Judy still hadn't moved. Her expression was unreadable, her breath shallow, and perhaps the most shocking thing of all was not what she had said, but what she had failed to say in return. For the first time, the queen of courtroom television had been rendered speechless, not by insult, not by disrespect, but by data, memory, and the undeniable force of lived experience. The same woman who once prided herself on always getting the last word now had no words left to stand on. And that absence, that void of response, was deafening. The studio lights remained steady, but the room felt darker, like the echo of a thunderstorm still lingering in the walls. The camera operators stood still, waiting for direction, but none came. The audience remained seated, not because they were told to, but because they couldn't leave. Not yet. They had witnessed a rupture in real time, a moment where power didn't shift gradually. It snapped. And when it snapped, it didn't make noise. It made clarity. As Jasmine exited the stage, the only thing louder than the silence was the knowledge now stitched into everyone's memory. That Judge Judy, the woman who never lost control, had just been met by someone who didn't want her crown, just her conscience. And what she found there was an empty bench. Judge Judy never recovered from that silence, and long after Jasmine Crockett walked out of the room, the aftershock kept rippling through the studio, the viewers, and the institutions that once claimed to know justice. In the days that followed, what happened in that studio didn't just trend, it transformed. The CNN town hall wasn't replayed for entertainment. It was dissected, analyzed, and taught. The footage of Jasmine Crockett standing her ground, exposing systemic hypocrisy without ever raising her voice, entered classrooms not as news, but as curriculum. At Harvard Law School, Professor Diane Morosky paused her legal theory lecture to cue the video. She told her students, "This is not a takedown. It's a demonstration of applied jurisprudence under emotional fire." In a Yale seminar called The Art of Civil Disobedience, the clip was shown in silence, twice followed by an hour-long breakdown of Crockett's use of restraint, body language, and evidence-based confrontation. What stood out wasn't that she won, it was how she did it, without shouting, without mockery, without weaponizing anger, even when she had every reason to. Legal scholars pointed to her timing, her rhetorical balance, her refusal to personalize injustice, even when Judge Judy tried to make it personal. Her handling of each jab, each microaggression, became a modern model of conflict de-escalation. At Stanford, the business school added it to its Leadership Under Pressure series. The scene where Jasmine calmly lifts a sealed court record and asks, "Do you remember Darnell Hayes?" became a case study in high-stakes persuasion. It wasn't just what she said, it was what she made the other person reveal without realizing. Business leaders cited her technique as a masterclass in keeping composure under public scrutiny. In one workshop, a Fortune 500 CEO reportedly paused the video and said, "If I could respond to shareholders the way she responded to power, I'd be untouchable." Meanwhile, high school debate leagues across the country adopted the footage as part of their state-level curriculum. In Austin, one coach told his team, "Watch her posture. She doesn't lean in. She doesn't flinch. That's not confidence, it's moral clarity." Teachers use the confrontation to show the difference between argument and antagonism. A public speaking course at UCLA titled one of its modules, "Volume Isn't Victory, the Jasmine Crockett Framework." In community colleges and law programs alike, her technique of pause before strike was dissected like a chess grandmaster's move. Her lines, delivered calmly but designed with precision, were treated like cross-examination scripts. You call that strength? That's bullying. One professor at Columbia wrote in his lecture notes, "This line dismantled 30 years of brand identity in one sentence." But it wasn't just schools. In conflict management programs, mediation training, and corporate HR sessions, Jasmine's performance became the North Star. Executive trainers used the clip to show how women, particularly women of color, can assert control in rooms engineered to undermine them. She didn't demand respect, one trainer told a group of middle managers. She created a moment where denying her respect became impossible. At Google's DEI program, the exchange was used to explore how implicit bias is often cloaked in professional polish. Judge Judy never used a slur. She never yelled. But the subtext, "You're too young, you're too new, you're too emotional," was unmistakable. Jasmine answered not with outrage, but with record numbers, legal precedent, and lived experience. Speakers and activists, too, began invoking Jasmine's performance. TEDx events titled talks after her core ideas. Justice has eyes. The pause that hit harder than any gavel. Don't fear bullies, even famous ones. Clips of her saying, "I don't fear bullies," no matter how famous they are, were cut into social media reels and campaign speeches. One political candidate used it as her campaign's closing ad. In a viral tweet that garnered over 4 million views, a user wrote, "Jasmine Crockett just did what hundreds of lawyers wish they could have done their whole careers, and she never raised her voice once." Another called it the best cross-examination since Atticus Finch. But unlike fiction, this one had consequences. Judge Judy had been untouchable. Until now. Workplace seminars played the video for teams dealing with hostile management. One HR consultant used it to teach what composure and power dynamics really looks like. Jasmine Crockett is not just a congresswoman, she said. She's a blueprint for conflict navigation in unjust spaces. Even therapists began referencing the event to explain trauma responses in public confrontation. "Jasmine didn't freeze," said one clinician during a leadership therapy session. "She channeled. That's power." It became clear this wasn't just about law or politics. It was about grace under systemic gaslighting and how that grace could win without begging for acceptance. Churches and community groups began holding watch parties. Black mothers in Atlanta organized a Justice and Jasmine roundtable to talk about how to teach their daughters self-advocacy without escalation. In Detroit, a group of formerly incarcerated individuals said the moment gave them a kind of justice they never got inside the system. Teachers in St. Louis showed the clip in civics class, asking students to spot the logical fallacies, and then to discuss how it felt emotionally. They didn't want the students just to learn from it. They wanted them to feel it. The line that haunted everyone the most wasn't shouted or even particularly loud, but it echoed deeper than any closing argument. "You turned a courtroom into a television show." It wasn't just a criticism of Judy. It was an indictment of spectacle justice, of the performative systems that disguise control as order and profit as principle. From political panels to legal podcasts, people finally asked what had gone unchallenged for too long. When does courtroom drama stop being justice and start being theater? And who pays the price when the lights go off? His studio still echoed with that final line. "I'm not afraid of bullies, no matter how famous they are." It wasn't shouted, it wasn't whispered, but somehow it felt louder than anything said all night. The kind of line that didn't need a microphone to travel. Jasmine Crockett didn't slam her hand on the table, didn't flinch, didn't blink. She simply stood there, spine straight, eyes locked on the woman across from her. Judge Judy didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Not because she lacked words, but because none would be enough. Not after everything that had been laid bare. In that silence, you could hear something shifting, an empire of authority, slowly cracking under the weight of one calm truth. Judge Judy had silenced thousands in her courtroom with a single glare. Her name had become a synonym for order, judgment, finality. But for the first time in 30 years, she wasn't the one commanding the silence. She was inside it, drowning in it. The woman who once made defendants tremble and plaintiffs trip over their words now sat frozen, shoulders stiff, jaw tight, eyes lowered just slightly, as if realizing the cameras weren't protecting her this time. For decades, Judy had built her brand on dominance, on sharp-tongued interruptions and thunderous verdicts. But Jasmine Crockett didn't play by the old rules. She didn't argue. She exposed. And that made her more dangerous than any gavel ever could. When Judy turned court into entertainment, she'd been untouchable. Millions tuned in every day to watch her scold, to watch her berate, to watch her win. She wasn't a judge. She was a performer with a robe. But Jasmine wasn't a guest in that world. She came to rewrite it. And she didn't need cue cards, a script, or a catchphrase. All she needed was her record, her voice, and the courage to face someone America never thought would have to explain themselves. When Jasmine said, "You made a show out of the courtroom," it wasn't an insult. It was an autopsy. The kind of sentence that doesn't kill a reputation. It just pronounces what was already dying. "Millions of dollars made by yelling at the poor," Jasmine continued. "You call that strength? I call it bullying." The studio didn't gasp. It exhaled. As if America, after 3 decades of watching Judy stand tall, had been waiting for someone to finally say it. Not out of spite, but out of need. The balance had tipped too far for too long, and Jasmine had simply reached out and pulled it back. Her voice didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. Her presence didn't waver. And for the first time, the great Judy Sheindlin did. No one had ever confronted Judy on her legacy like that. Not a host, not a journalist, not a politician. Her brand was built on certainty. Her show was edited for triumph. Her myth lived in reruns. But that night, Jasmine broke through it with nothing but lived truth. And Judy couldn't edit around it. She couldn't cut to commercial. She couldn't bark, "That's enough," and have it stick. Jasmine had already won, not with a knockout, but with surgical precision. Piece by piece, she removed the armor Judy had worn for years. The authority, the sharp tongue, the glare, the robe. And what remained wasn't a monster. It was a woman, unprepared for her own reflection. In the days that followed, the world didn't cancel Judy. It reconsidered her. Legal scholars revisited her rulings. Professors discussed the ethics of televised justice. Commentators, once enamored by her tough love, questioned whether it had been justice at all or just judgment served with flair. Old fans grew quiet. Loyal viewers shifted uncomfortably. Her silence at the end of the town hall, head lowered, lips pressed thin, became a meme, but not a mocking one. It was iconic because it marked a turning point. The moment when strength wasn't volume, when dominance wasn't dignity, when the courtroom was no longer hers alone. Meanwhile, Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't tweet a soundbite. She didn't call a press conference. She simply packed her notes, stood up, and walked out. Calm, steady, aware that something irreversible had occurred. She hadn't just debated a legend. She had dismantled a structure, and she did it not by raising her voice, but by raising the bar. No insults, no spectacle. Just truth, calmly delivered. She became the new measure, not of anger, but of articulation. Not of confrontation, but of clarity. Not of celebrity, but of conviction. The beauty of that moment wasn't just in what was said, but in how it was received. Cameras caught the audience, once rapt by Judy's every word, now turning their attention to Jasmine. The energy shifted. The applause didn't erupt, it simmered. A slow, respectful acknowledgement that this wasn't about entertainment anymore. It was about a reckoning. It was about the unmasking of power. And it was led not by noise, but by nerve. From that day forward, people remembered the silence more than the shouts. They remembered Judy's lowered eyes more than her raised voice. And they remembered Jasmine, not as the woman who beat a legend, but as the woman who outgrew her, with grace, with facts, with fire under control. She didn't crush Judy. She cracked the glass and showed the world what was hiding behind the reflection. The silence still lingered like smoke in a courtroom that had just witnessed a verdict no one saw coming. Judge Judy, the titan of televised justice, sat frozen. Her signature glare faded, her authority diminished not by volume, but by truth. Jasmine Crockett had not just spoken. She had recalibrated the entire meaning of power in that room. As the lights dimmed and the cameras slowed their rotation, the energy didn't shift back. It hung there, suspended in the still air, waiting for something, anything, that could name what had just happened. But Jasmine wasn't done. Not yet. One final question remained, and it wasn't for the judge. It was for the nation. She turned slowly, her heels silent against the studio floor, her eyes scanning not just the audience, but the idea of justice itself. She wasn't posturing. She wasn't grandstanding. What she said next wasn't written in any prep memo or rehearsed in front of any mirror. It came from the marrow, from the weight of everything she had seen, fought, and survived. Her voice was quiet, deliberately so, but each syllable carried like the crack of a gavel in a cathedral. "Let me ask one final question," she said, turning directly toward the lens, unblinking. "Is justice the voice of the powerful, or the voice of those who were once silenced?" A chill swept through the room. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. The kind that hums in your bones when something bigger than politics, bigger than reputation, bigger than ratings, has just been said. Anderson Cooper lowered his head slightly, his fingers curled against the cue cards in front of him. But he didn't speak. No one did. Because Jasmine had struck at the root, at the contradiction America never stopped wrestling with. In one line, she shattered decades of courtroom theater, political noise, and moral detours. She didn't ask who won. She asked who deserved to speak. And the difference echoed like a thunderclap in a canyon. Judy shifted in her seat just slightly, but enough for cameras to catch it. The woman once synonymous with absolute judgment now seemed questioned, not accused, not humiliated, but human. Because the question wasn't just about her, it was about a nation that often defined justice by who had the louder microphone, the sharper suit, the longer resume. Jasmine wasn't offering revenge. She was offering a mirror. One large enough to show everyone their reflection, especially the people who had never had to see it before. And in doing so, she wasn't just confronting Judge Judy. She was confronting the very machinery of authority. The brilliance of the question wasn't just rhetorical, it was surgical. It cut through every layer of bias, tradition, and comfort. It forced the audience, the viewers, the nation to ask, who controls the gavel, and who never got a seat at the table? Jasmine didn't need to answer it. She was the answer. A Black woman, the descendant of voices long erased, now standing with the mic, the facts, and the clarity. She had survived being dismissed, disrespected, interrupted, and underestimated. And instead of screaming back, she did something more radical. She asked a question no one could ignore. The camera slowly zoomed in on Jasmine's face, not for drama, but for truth. There was no smugness in her eyes, no self-congratulation, just a quiet defiance rooted in legacy, in every ancestor who had been silenced, in every client she defended, in every folder of injustice she had carried into courtrooms that weren't designed for her. This wasn't a performance, it was a declaration that justice doesn't always arrive in robes or gavels or press releases. Sometimes it walks in quietly, pulls out receipts, and asks a question that burns longer than any verdict. People at home didn't just watch the moment, they felt it. Across living rooms and classrooms, the line was repeated, rewound, written down. Is justice the voice of the powerful, or the voice of those who were once silenced? It didn't sound like a headline. It sounded like a reckoning. Professors paused their lectures to play it. Students scribbled it into notebooks. Public defenders smiled through tears. And somewhere in a quiet corner of America, a mother with no legal degree finally felt heard, because someone had finally named what she'd always known. Back on set, Judy didn't respond. Not because she was defeated, but because she had no defense. Not for the numbers, not for the past cases, not for the silence. Jasmine didn't demand an apology. She didn't need one. Her question was the verdict. Her restraint was the revolution. And as she turned, picked up her binder, and nodded to Anderson, the room didn't erupt in applause. It stayed quiet, reverent, like after a sermon, or a funeral, or a rebirth. The impact didn't end when the lights cut off. That one sentence, the final one, traveled like a ripple across a national conscience. It was quoted on news panels, dissected in editorials, printed on classroom posters. Civil rights groups adopted it as a slogan. Judges quoted it in their dissenting opinions. One even etched it on the inside cover of his legal briefcase. Because that question wasn't just about race or gender or law, it was about power and who gets to define what fairness sounds like. By the time Jasmine exited the building, she wasn't walking out of a studio. She was walking into a movement, but she didn't wave. She didn't smile for cameras. She didn't stop to pose. She simply walked, like someone who knew her job wasn't to win moments. Her job was to build memory. Memory that sticks, that spreads, that teaches. That whispers into ears long after the noise fades. Memory that reminds a nation that justice starts not with answers, but with the courage to ask the right question. And that's exactly what she did. And when the question finally landed, when Jasmine Crockett stood silent after asking it, something shifted not just in that studio, but in the hearts of everyone who heard it. Is justice the voice of the powerful, or the voice of those who were once silenced? It wasn't a line meant to sting. It was a line meant to awaken, not just for Judy, not just for lawmakers, but for anyone who had ever believed that justice belonged only to people in suits, on pedestals, behind benches. Jasmine didn't just confront a person, she confronted a culture. And in that confrontation, she left behind something far more valuable than a mic drop moment. She left behind a mirror. And now we all have to decide what we're going to see when we look into it. The lesson here isn't about humiliation or revenge. It's about recognition. It's about the long, painful distance between law and justice. It's about understanding that fairness doesn't come from fame or tradition or who shouts loudest. It comes from the willingness to examine the systems we've accepted for too long and the courage to ask who they were built for. Jasmine didn't demand that we tear it all down. She asked us to see what's already broken, to stop pretending that equality exists just because it's written in a preamble. Because until justice listens to the voices it once ignored, it will always be incomplete. It will always favor the strong, and it will always leave someone behind. This isn't just a courtroom issue. This is a classroom issue, a hiring issue, a healthcare issue. It's in the way we assume guilt based on skin, in the way we treat pain differently depending on where someone lives, in the way one child gets therapy and another gets handcuffs. It's about who gets second chances and who never even gets a first. Jasmine Crockett didn't bring new data. She brought what we've always known, but what we've been too polite or too afraid to say out loud, that power protects itself. And when it does, it disguises itself as law, as order, as just doing the job. But Jasmine made one thing clear. Doing the job without conscience is not justice. It's ritual. The deeper truth is this. We've mistaken performance for fairness. We've allowed people to build careers on the backs of the vulnerable. We've called it tough love when it was just cruelty in a robe. And we've applauded those who humiliate the weak in the name of discipline, never stopping to ask why they're the only ones being dragged into the spotlight. Jasmine wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every mother who lost a child to a system that saw numbers, not names. For every teenager whose future was decided by the zip code they were born into. For every man who served 15 years because he didn't have the money to fight a charge, someone else got dropped with one phone call. But here's what makes Jasmine's lesson unforgettable. She didn't weaponize her pain. She weaponized her discipline. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She walked into a room built to make her feel small and left as the only one who grew taller. That is what resistance looks like. Not in slogans, not in riots, but in a woman who refuses to be reduced to her rage, in a woman who comes armed with truth, case law, receipts, and silence sharper than any insult. And the message that silence sent was simple. I'm not here to out-talk you. I'm here to outlast you. So what now? What happens after the applause fades? After the clip goes viral? After the headlines change? That's the real test. Because this can't just be another viral moment. It has to become a personal one, a political one, a cultural one. Every viewer, every voter, every judge, every teacher, every employer, we all have a responsibility now to listen differently, to question louder, to stop pretending that justice just happens naturally. Jasmine didn't make change in that room. She made space for it, and that space has to be filled. Not with more noise, but with more awareness, with more voices, especially the ones we were taught to overlook. One of the most powerful things about Jasmine's stand was what she didn't say. She didn't claim to be perfect. She didn't pretend to have all the answers. She just insisted that the questions be asked. She insisted that stories be told. And she reminded us that the courtroom is not just where verdicts are given, it's where history is written. Every biased ruling, every double standard, every ignored plea becomes part of that record. And if we don't rewrite it, if we don't challenge it, it will outlive us. That's why Jasmine stood tall, not to win a debate, but to remind us that justice is not a destination. It's a demand, a daily one. This moment also reminded us that fame does not equal credibility, that a long career does not make someone immune to accountability. Judge Judy sat for 30 years behind a bench, wielding a gavel like a sword. But it took Jasmine, one woman, one voice, to reveal that authority without empathy is just another form of dominance, that shouting down the vulnerable is not justice. It's theater. And that real strength isn't measured by how many people you silence. It's measured by how many you uplift. Jasmine didn't need volume to win. She needed vision, and she had it. That's why Judy fell silent, not because she was beaten, but because she was revealed. There's a reason why this story is being played in classrooms and courtrooms, in churches and living rooms. It's because it speaks to something we've all felt, the sense that the rules aren't the same for everyone, that some people get the benefit of the doubt, while others get the full weight of the law. That justice too often waits until the victim is polished and the perpetrator is poor. Jasmine Crockett didn't just talk about this. She lived it. She studied it. She bled through it. And when the time came, she stood in a room that tried to silence her and asked one question that refused to stay quiet. So the lesson is this: courage is quiet, power is shared, and justice must be earned. We can't wait for heroes to show up. We have to become them, in how we vote, in how we speak, in how we listen, and most of all, in how we treat the people no one's watching. The measure of a just society isn't how it treats the famous, it's how it defends the forgotten. And Jasmine didn't just remind us of that, she embodied it. And maybe, just maybe, that's where real change begins. Not with a mic drop, but with a mirror. And the courage to ask, am I fighting for the powerful? Or am I finally listening to the silenced? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.